I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another weekly episode of the global podcast Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. We invite you, in fact, we urge you to become a member of this podcast by simply going to graymatter.show. That's gray with an E. Our weekly deep dive interviews include your questions and comments as we cover a wide range of intellectually stimulating and engaging topics and issues with leading national and international experts, authors, artists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. Interviews distinguished by their high, rich content and technical excellence. In this episode, we welcome Nicholas B. Dirks, who served from 2010 to 2013 as the 10th Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. Prior to that, he was Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University, where he was also Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and History. And presently, he holds the position of President and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. The author of several books, including Autobiography of an Archive, The Scandal of Empire, Casts of Mind, and The Hollow Crown. His most recent book is City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University. And it's an important book, and a book that really takes up what I think of as urgent questions of the moment with respect to the university's future, or college futures, and higher education future in general. But it's also a very personal book in many ways, and there's much in that book for us to talk about, and I hope we will have an opportunity to do so. But I want to first of all welcome Nick and say that we're going to talk about many things before we get to your book here, because there's many things in the news that I really want to touch on and get your thoughts about. Good to see you again. Good to be with you again.
Great to be with you, Michael.
I thought actually you'd begin by talking about a trajectory and finding out where you think we are now. And by that trajectory, I mean, my memory goes back to the free speech movement and goes back to Mario Savio and all that. And then we saw really a sort of major shifting of what, for lack of a better word, I would call sensibilities. Jeane Kirkpatrick was shouted down, the former UN ambassador at the University of California, Berkeley. That was a pretty revelatory moment. And during your chancellorship, there were people who came to the campus who were problems with free speech. Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, those names harken us back to that. But now we're at a point where just recently there was seemingly maybe a right to riot in the minds of some students, shut down the building over at Zellerbach Hall. 200 people broke down the door, and it was an Israeli lawyer who had links to the IDF, and they didn't want him to speak, and he didn't speak. And talk about that trajectory. Where are we now? Are we at that stage now where people who you don't agree with, you shut down and you say, I'll get enough people mobilized, and they don't speak?
Well, you're absolutely right, Michael, to point to what seems to be a constantly changing trajectory in terms of free speech and the kinds of issues around protest on college campuses in general, but, UC Berkeley in particular. All the protests that took place back in 1964 around free speech were meant precisely to make the campus an open and welcoming environment for speech of all kinds and for political speech in particular, but with the idea that the more voices, the better. When famously Mario Savio on December 8th of 1964 was told that the faculty had supported the agitation around free speech and really led the way to Clark Kerr reversing the earlier decision by the regents to keep all political speech off campus. That was part of a decision or set of decisions around the neutrality of campuses. The way you maintain neutrality before 64 was precisely to have no political speech of any kind. But when Savio was told that his movement was going to be victorious, he said, well, now comes the time that we need to invoke, and he invoked Diogenes. He was a classics and philosophy major, to say that with that kind of privilege, with the right to speak and the right to engage in that kind of political speech, came great responsibility. That seems like a very, very long time ago. I was chancellor in 2014 when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the free speech movement, and at that point too, there was a real commitment to allowing speech of any kind to take place, even though there were protests and other things that took place. But as I talk about in the book, and as you know, because we were chatting periodically during those years, in the winter of 2017, it seemed like everything began to change. And that's when Milo Yiannopoulos came to campus. He was about to speak. His speaking event was shut down by a violent protest that was mostly made up of people, it seemed, from off campus, but nevertheless led to a complete shutdown of the event, the need to escort Milo off campus for fear that he was actually going to be vulnerable to some kind of physical injury. And then $100,000 worth of damage on the Berkeley campus alone, as well as damage in the city of Berkeley just next to the campus. That then prefaced, a whole set of things that took place in Berkeley, both on the campus and in the town. There were riots over the summer that took place around about the same time as, of course, the big events that took place in Charlottesville. But in all of that, there was both, great passionate involvement in political issues. That was familiar. But there was also this new sense that, the way to protest something is to shut it down. I experienced it myself when I was chancellor, and the provost and I were on various occasions told that, they were the crowd that had come to listen to us really just wanted to protest and make it impossible for us to speak. But what happened last week, I'm now in New York. I'm not in Berkeley, so I don't know the actual, the specific circumstances beyond what I read. But again, it's this move from protest to enacting political protest through basically making it impossible for somebody you disagree with to speak at all. And it feels to me like a moment that exemplifies what has been, coming into formation for some time, but which is a very, very dangerous tendency to think about a campus as a place where you just don't want to hear anything you don't agree with. And that, of course, has been the subject of a lot of thinking, a lot of worry, some recommendations about what to do, but it is to me a very serious challenge to what I consider to be the fundamental idea of the university.
Well, the fundamental idea also in my mind goes back to one of the first protests that I was ever involved in was one that I led against an American Nazi party leader named George Lincoln Rockwell. And we filed in, we sat down, all wearing white shirts, were completely quiet, and then got up and walked out to show our disrespect and to show our disagreement. There was an idea, in other words, that you even listened to ideas that were odious just to hear what they had to say and to factor it into a sort of expansive view or a different view of debates and ideas. It's gone. It seems to be gone. I don't know where the link occurred. In fact, I've got a question from a listener in Aurora who says, why do you think so many administrators seem to be weak when confronting anti-Semitism? That's not necessarily relevant to what we're talking about here, but there does seem to be a weakness, as we saw with those three presidents who spoke and were kind of beaten up by Stefanik for their unwillingness to, or their evasiveness, or however you want to call it. How much of this has to do with the lack of administrative will, and how much of it just has to do with, a sea change, a seismic sea change?
Yeah, it's hard to answer because, of course, on the one hand, administrators, certainly in public universities, but also in private universities, are often bound. In the case of public universities, they are bound by law to protect freedom of speech. So unless something crosses a particular line, the idea that a protest can take place, that people can say things that you will disagree with, can criticize the actions of the American government, or for that matter, the Israeli government, or other political actors in the world, that goes with the First Amendment to the Constitution, where, of course, we're running into unbelievably vexing issues today, has to do with the fact that it doesn't feel like a lot of the people involved in protest really care about or believe in or seek to adhere to the principles of free speech. At the same time, that the kinds of protests that are taking place around actions in Gaza make it very difficult to parse or to adjudicate, what is being critical of a government and what is, in fact, an attack that would be seen as a form of violence against, or threats of violence against a people, whether it's Jews or the Muslims or any number of different categories in the population. But the issue of administrative weakness is also, I think, the larger question of how administrators deal with this changing environment that you identified and that we've been discussing. It's not easy to do that. I don't want to be the armchair quarterback who says, if I were chancellor, I'd do this or do that today, because it's a very difficult seat to sit in. But I do think there are a few things that have become clear over the last few months. One is that if you're asked, even if you're set up and you're going to be set up in a congressional inquiry, if you're asked, are there rules against calling for the genocide of a people? You come out and say, yes, there are rules against it. It's a very clear question, and you can give a very clear answer. But that doesn't mean that it translates directly into a playbook for how you deal with protests that are taking place in such a contested arena as currently exists in relationship to the Middle East.
It's vexing, as you said, and that vexation seems to have been allied in some ways with other questions that are really very provocative. Now, I remember talking to a professor at Cal who teaches Latin American history, and a couple of students said, they're studying history, and the history of Latin America is pretty bloody and violent, and they said that they felt that they weren't in a safe space, and they felt that there were trigger warnings that they were experiencing. In other words, we've got this whole different sensibility, for lack of a better word to describe it, microaggressions, words like that have been factored in suddenly to our discourse. And the result of that, it seems to me, has been moving away from what perhaps you and I have revered and hallowed as the ideal of a university education, where you hear all kinds of ideas cascading at you, and you should hear all kinds of ideas, and you accept them in a polite discourse with a polite rhetoric.
Well, part of the purpose of the university education is to learn things, experience things, read things, and debate things that will make you feel uncomfortable, because they take you precisely out of your comfort zone and expose you to, very new, very different, and sometimes very challenging ways of viewing the world, or certainly certain parts of the world. The idea that an education is to make you uncomfortable seems to have gone by the wayside, and now, of course, there's demands for safe spaces that are effectively about making sure that every space on campus can be comfortable. But it's important to remember that when, for example, courses on the history of Christianity were first taught by a new generation of scholars who actually historicized the Christian, the church and the Christian message and so on. There were a lot of people who complained they were feeling uncomfortable because it would be seen as, by some, blasphemous to suggest that, that the Bible or the Word of God had actually been changed over time by human action in ways that are, now taken for granted in a certain kind of biblical criticism and scholarship. That kind of discomfort has, I think, been the experience of generations of people who go to college and they learn things that they didn't know at home. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz once said, if you don't want home truths, don't leave home. And, that's what we've always assumed that university education was all about. I don't mind a request to as a professor to begin a class by saying, we're going to discuss some things that may be difficult for you, that these are issues that we're going to talk about. It's like getting a warning before you see a movie. There's going to be violence. There's going to be, smoking, as we now read every time we watch a film like Oppenheimer. I think, if students want to have some intimation of what's going to come in a classroom discussion, that's fine. But the idea that one can't actually talk about difficult things seems to run up against some of the fundamental principles of what higher education is all about. Indeed, what scholarship is all about, what free inquiry is about. And that, I think, requires that we really engage in a period both of deep reflection and kind of recommitment almost to these ideas of academic freedom, of free inquiry, and also that we recommit to finding ways to talk with people we disagree with. I think if we can't do that in a university, God help us, because it would seem to be the case that a university is in fact a much safer space than, for example, the world of politics or business or things that go on outside a university, where the stakes are immediate and often very, very real, rather than just the exchange of different kinds of ideas.
Well, then what to do? I want to go to some questions here. We're getting questions, good questions, and yet there's a lot I feel I need to explore with you. What to do about hate speech? I mean, there are laws against hate speech on the books in different places. There are different laws, but on the university, you protect hate speech, Islamophobia, anti-Semitic speech, these kinds of things?
Well, again, this is a complicated issue. On the one hand, before I went to Columbia, I was at the University of Michigan, and Michigan in the 1980s actually enacted a number of internal prohibitions on hate speech because of concern about the way in which it was clearly being seen that certain forms of speech were directed at particular communities and seemed to violate rules against discrimination and equal opportunity. But some of those regulations were taken to court, and in court they were all struck down because, again, in a public university, hate speech is not a crime unless it is speech that is very specifically directed against a community, an ethnicity, a racial group, or members of a particular religious faith. There are, real limits to how you can restrict hate speech on a public university campus, given the current state of our jurisprudence. So, you have that. But then you also, of course, have, and this is, repeatedly given voice to by university administrators across both public and private universities, statements about, for example, at Berkeley, community principles of the community that include giving respectful hearing to people who have different views, different ideas, as well as different identities and different kinds of backgrounds and perspectives. The community principles at Berkeley include a call for civility. And, civility in that sense is not about restricting speech, but it is about directing disagreement to forms of respectful dialogue that are meant to encourage engagement rather than just set people apart and have them shouting slogans from different parts of the campus at each other in ways that can sound violent and often seem to effectively become hate speech. So there are real limits there, Michael, in terms of what universities can do, and there are also, as a result, real contradictions in what universities say. So on the one hand, they talk about free speech, they talk about academic freedom, they talk about freedom of inquiry. On the other hand, they talk about being inclusive, being welcoming to everyone. They talk about belonging and how everyone should feel as if they belong within the university community. And if you put those things next to each other, there's friction at best, and sometimes downright contradiction.
I'll pursue some of this with you, but like I said, some questions are coming in, and I want to go to these questions, beginning with David, who has a question. He's in New York City, and thanks for the question, David. He says, higher education is undergoing rapid changes due to technological advancements and changing societal needs. What do you believe are the most pressing challenges facing universities today? Well, that's your whole book, in part.
Well, there's so many different components to the kinds of challenges that are confronting universities. I mean, I think it's important, while we're talking about questions around free speech, to also talk about a couple of other things, and I do talk about them in the book. One of which is simply around questions of access. And by access, I don't mean just who gets in, and what the whole process of university admissions is made up of, but also the cost of higher education. And this is something that has just become more and more intense, especially after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. I think it was in 2011 that the amount of student debt in this country went up over $1 trillion, and it's now much, much more than that. But it's clear that the cost of higher education, even in public universities that, of course, charge much lower rates of tuition than the private universities, has become an increasing impediment to access to higher education. I mean, there was a time, and when I was chancellor, Jerry Brown was governor, and Governor Brown was a graduate of UC Berkeley. And he would tell me on a regular basis, he said, when I came to Berkeley, I only paid $70 a semester in fees. Why can't you go back and, make it effectively free again? And of course, my response to that, as indeed every other chancellor and the president of the university system, was, that's when the state gave a lot more money. 70% or so of the university budget came from the state when he was a student at Berkeley.
Forgive me, I should also mention, just as a footnote, you write about his wanting you to, shall we say, diminish your own salary, which was something he was demanding. He was talking about psychic dollars early on in his first gubernatorial campaign, and he continued that sort of argument with you. But let me just for a minute focus on this, or laser in on it, because now we're talking about forgiveness of student loans. Last night, the president gave a State of the Union speech where he, in fact, highlighted his forgiveness of student loans. And there are a lot of people who are very angry and upset about that because, they felt burdened by student loans, paid off their student loans, and now there's going to be forgiveness. Or there are people who are saying, well, colleges and universities should be free, no money at all. Why pay tuition? They can be subsidized and paid for. So we're in that kind of embroiled state constantly now, and just in terms of what you've outlined here and what you set in motion.
The question of forgiving student debt in a way does beg the question because the problem is that student debt has become such a major factor in the lives of people who have gone to college, and of course, oftentimes the greatest amount of debt has been carried by people who don't get a degree, who don't actually graduate from college. So they don't get the benefits of a college education in terms of what it can bring in the way of income later on in life to allow one to pay things back or pay one's loans back. But it also speaks to the problem that we're facing, which is that somebody has to pay. Back when, the public universities were free or close to being free, the state did provide a lot more money. These are political decisions, and little by little, from the 1960s to the first decade of the 21st century, the percentage of state support went from, as I just said, 70% to, when I started as chancellor in 2013, to 12%. So if the state is not going to pay for that, somebody else has to. Now, you can say universities have to reduce their expenses, and that only if they really radically think about their expenses can they ever get to the point where they'll charge less, given the levels of state support. And I actually think that there are ways in which universities can economize. There are lots of questions about administrative cadres, whether there is administrative bloat, statistics about the number of administrators in universities. And some of that can be explained by virtue of the fact there's much more demand for people involved in compliance around research. But there are a lot of other things that have been added into expectations around what a university is going to provide students, faculty, staff, and the like, which then leads to this kind of, perpetual bureaucratic mode of reproduction, hiring more staff to look after this need or that need or this request or that request. And I think that really the time has come when we have to take some kind of collective responsibility for the fact that we keep ratcheting up the cost of higher education. But at the same time, if you're going to have a top university like Berkeley, which competes for faculty with the very best universities, public and private, across the country and indeed across the world, if you're going to have, Nobel laureates teaching, physics, if you're going to have, a top 5 economics department, if you're going to offer the range of courses and majors and concentrations and programs that a place like Berkeley offers, it's not going to come cheap. Somebody has to pay for it. One of the things I talk about, Michael, in the book, as you know, is that we don't have to have all our universities be the same. I think we have to, at the same time that we're thinking about how to control costs in single institutions, we have to think about the whole ecosystem of higher education and take seriously the possibility that we're too governed by the idea that everybody is seeking to be better ranked in a single ranking system like that of U.S. News and Roll the Report. Maybe we can use different kinds of measures for what would become a much more highly heterogeneous landscape for higher education, and some of that can be offered using more technology, which allows economies of scale and certainly reduces the cost of a professoriate when you're thinking about classroom instruction on a regular basis. I think, without going into the specific proposals that I or others make, the real key here is to begin to think about delinking some of the things that have been agglomerated all together, so that every college, every university thinks they have to do everything in order to get the best ranking possible. As I said, in a single ranking system.
Well, you're right also about the internationalization of universities. And one of the ways of generating more revenue was getting more foreign students who pay higher tuition. And the result of that is that we've got a different student population. Some feel that we've been veering more toward, for example, Arab students because they can afford the cost. And that's also a part of what concerns many people, I think, in terms of generational shift now. The other thing that comes to mind here is the fact that, well, actually what comes to mind are some questions, which I want to go to, some more questions from people who are listening. But they used to talk about the corporatization of universities, and that was a big, almost hobby horse for many radical students and students on the left. Now they're talking about the over-influence of donors. Bill Ackman, for example, comes to mind, that they're writing things and saying things in public that are critical of the university, and they're getting a lot of attention because of all the money they give. So money, like with Congress, with lobbyists and so forth, is what rules here. And the deficiency and need for more money in the universities is something that's paramount. But let me go to Lisa, who's raising kind of a related question. And Lisa, thank you for this. She says, how do you envision the future of public higher education, particularly in terms of accessibility and affordability?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a great question because I think it really is the obligation of public universities to make proposals about what and how they might be supported in order to really become accessible, both around questions of just admission and around questions having to do with cost. Again, in the case of UC Berkeley, it's a little bit of, in success lies failure. Berkeley's gotten to be better and better. More people want to go there. And of course, what happens is more and more people apply and fewer people get in, or more people don't get in. So it's now become, in some programs, as competitive in terms of admission as the best private universities. There are programs at Berkeley that are harder to get into than Stanford, not all the way across the board, but there are some. And then, of course, people will think, why should I, advocate for my tax dollars to be spent to support a university that my kids can't get into? And then it becomes a vicious circle, right? So that
the kids from foreign governments can get into because they pay the higher tuitions.
Because they pay, yeah. Now, when I was chancellor, we actually increased the absolute number of California students who were getting admitted to the university. But we also brought in students both from out of state and from out of country. And by the way, they whether you're from Nevada or or India, you're paying the same tuition. It's the same out of state tuition. But we increased those numbers in part because they helped support the university at a financial level that actually benefited California students by putting more money into the pool for financial aid, and it was it was a net benefit. Now, there are other reasons to have students from other states and indeed from other countries, because that kind of diversity, I think, among other forms of diversity, does enhance the student experience. It enhances all kinds of things in order to be able to interact with people from China and India and the Gulf, as well as people from the East Coast or the South or wherever, including, of course, many from California. But that that the problem, of course, and we've just presented these two different kinds of arguments. Problem is, if you're being really driven by financial decisions, you tend to think, well, I'll just endlessly increase the number of out-of-state international students who come because I need the money, and you're not making the decision about trying to find the right balance in terms of issues of diversity that would be optimal in that kind of situation. So, again, too often decisions are being made for financial reasons. And I understand that. I've sat in that kind of chair and I've seen what it's like to confront massive budget deficits and not be sure where you're going to find the money to pay the bills.
Is it easier in private universities then, generally? I mean, you were at Columbia, then you went to Berkeley. There's certainly one of the best private universities in the East Coast and the country, and one of the best, maybe one could argue, the best public university in the country. So you've had both experiences. Where's it easier to realize the ideals that you speak of higher education? Or where's it harder, maybe?
Yeah, where is it harder is a better way of putting it. I mean, on the one hand, one of the reasons I went from Columbia to Berkeley is because Berkeley is able to recruit students from a much more diverse set of backgrounds, and it by virtue of scale, and by virtue of its history and reputation as a major public university, it's able to offer a great education to students who have a much harder time getting into some of the Ivy League schools. But it was very difficult to manage the finances of the university when it was the governor and the legislature and the regents who made all the decisions, often on the basis of political considerations, about how much tuition you could charge, even if you were offering a lot of financial aid at the same time, and indeed around a lot of other of the levers that in a private university you actually can adjust in the administration just by working with your local board of trustees. So it was easier to manage your finances at Columbia. I basically set the level of tuition along with the trustees, but it was also frustrating because it was a much more scarce resource, and even though we gave very generous packages of financial aid for students, we also recruited students who could pay full freight, and full freight at Columbia at that time was around $50,000, at the same time that full freight for a California student going to Berkeley was $12,000. So, you look at this picture and you try to, compare them, and you see that issues about accessibility, both around getting in and paying for it, are really difficult.
I guess as Nicholas Dirks, his new book is City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University. City of Intellect, by the way, comes from Clark Kerr, who was the first chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, the 12th president. And there is an epigraph from him, which I just want to bring to your attention here, because it kind of pinpoints a lot of what we're talking about. The 20th century was a grand century for the cities of intellect. That century is now past, never to be replicated. Fateful words. Let me go to some more questions from Seattle, Washington. Kelly asks, and thank you, Kelly, for the question. In your opinion, what are the essential qualities of an effective university leader in today's academic landscape?
So it's a great question, and I have to say it's become harder and harder to answer. I think over the years there have been really extraordinary people who have entered university administrations and then become presidents or chancellors, and Clark Kerr is a signal example of that, who were also great visionaries. Under Kerr's leadership, first at Berkeley and then as president of the system, the University of California grew exponentially, established new campuses across the state. It developed what was called the Master Plan back in 1960, which was effectively a way to ensure that there would be access either to one of the Cal State campuses or to the University of California campus for students who performed at a certain level in any public school in the state. It articulated agreements between community colleges and universities with four-year degree programs. And Kerr was extraordinary. Now, Kerr didn't want to step down from being president in January of 1967 when he was actually fired by the Board of Regents. And he was fired because there was a new governor in the state of California who took over from Pat Brown. His name is Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan ran for governor in part on his pledge at the time, which he said repeatedly, to clean up the mess at Berkeley. And so Kerr, who was actually quite measured around the questions that were out there at the time, even around the free speech movement, he only kind of capitulated to accept it fully.
And forgive me, lest we forget, Reagan made that infamous speech where he said, "If you need a bloodbath," he was talking about the possibility of violence coming down on the University of California, Berkeley.
Absolutely. But the point is that that even though Kerr did ultimately get fired for political reasons, he was an exceptional leader. And I think there are, lots of others who have stepped up, not just as good managers, but as people who deeply believed in the importance of a leadership in universities who would speak out on behalf of the values of higher education. Increasingly, given the kinds of pressures on university presidents and chancellors, I think the role has become more managerial. Being a visionary doesn't really turn out to be a great career move for the most part.
The biggest part of the job is fundraising, isn't it?
And you have to spend a great deal of your time fundraising, which also goes back to your question about the role of activist donors. But these days, and I talk about this in the book, these days in a curious way, the most visionary academic leaders have been those who became leaders of universities that were sort of in the third tier, where there wasn't a lot of resistance to change because any change would be for the better. And then you've seen, for example, under Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University and has been in that role since 2002, just an exceptional history of not just change, but of massive improvement and also massive innovation. For the last 10 years, ASU has been ranked as the most innovative university in America. But that kind of leadership is rare because basically between fundraising and ameliorating, questions and concerns and complaints from political figures and from alumni and from donors, is not a lot of room for vision.
More questions. Jim in Boise, Idaho wants to know about companies like Google starting to show impatience with the effectiveness and output of universities by launching programs like Grow with Google. How do universities keep up with direct corporate education? Thanks for the question, Jim.
The truth is that many universities have introduced new kinds of master's programs that are intended to offer appropriate kinds of training and upskilling for not just for students but for people in corporate roles, precisely to accommodate the needs of the marketplace. So I there's actually a lot of feedback that goes back and forth between those kinds of programs and innovations that have come out of Google and others, and how universities are actually thinking about some of their academic programs. But I'd like to kind of, if I may, use that question to address another but very, very important issue for me anyway, which is, how do you justify the kind of commitment to a liberal arts education that most of our great universities continue, at least to give lip service to, with the increasing interest on the part of students and their parents to basically have universities provide skills that will directly translate into careers, to become in some ways more like vocational schools than the liberal arts kind of model of old.
It's sort of like STEM versus the arts and humanities. In many ways, we've got that kind of bifurcation, don't we?
Well, in part STEM, but there's been where has some of the biggest growth been in programs? Certainly in computer science, but also in fields like business administration and healthcare administration and other things where there are, in fact, direct jobs, careers that will come out, will be there once you finish those programs, and increasingly, the liberal arts are seen as either being a waste of time or just a kind of luxury that only the very rich and very rich institutions should go for. But I think what we're seeing now in the world of technology, and you're seeing it at Google, and you're seeing it at OpenAI, and you're seeing it in Microsoft, and you're seeing it virtually everywhere in all the discussions that are taking place, for example, about artificial intelligence, is the extent to which you really don't want to have this bifurcation take too much hold. It seems to me, anyway, more and more important for people who learn the kind of technical computational skills that go into what the skill set you need to advance in working in fields like artificial intelligence, with precisely the kinds of things that are taught in a liberal arts education. After all, what are we talking about now? We're talking about ethics and AI. Well, you don't get ethics from taking courses in CS. You get ethics from taking courses in the liberal arts. That is not to say that you shouldn't also be doing, coding and advanced data analytics and other kinds of things that give you that kind of technical skill set that you would need to be able to actually use those courses you would take in ethics to translate into algorithms that do a better job of avoiding bias, of producing positive kinds of outcomes, of anticipating social, cultural, and even economic effects with in relationship to AI. So, I think we're at a time when we actually have to return to a broader commitment to a kind of holistic education.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity for me to give a plug for a book by Michael Roth, I suspect president of Wesleyan University, who made a very strong argument for a liberal education, for a traditional liberal education being once again brought into higher education. But you gave a talk not that long ago in Orlando, a Technonomy 23 talk, it was called, about, the title of the talk was The Peril and Power of AI. And significantly, you were emphasizing things like consciousness and soul and humanity and those kinds of things, which when people think about higher education for their kids, they think, well, like you said, we want something that's going to mean a job, right?
Yep.
And so those sorts of things become de-emphasized, and yet those are the kinds of things which open up minds and which open up hearts and which are so invaluable in many ways. In fact, Fran from Boggsville, Pennsylvania says, you touched on passing, but could you please elaborate and say how online or remote education brings benefits of a higher education to a much wider student body? Kind of ties in with what we're talking about now.
Yeah, sure. I think that when the first MOOCs came out in 2011, there was this incredibly successful course that was being taught by Sebastian Thrum at Stanford on artificial intelligence, in fact, for which he put out online, for which he got something like 170,000 people across the world to sign up. And it looked like it was immediately going to change the delivery of education, because it would make it close to free to take a course with a leading computer scientist from Stanford. Now, it turns out a lot of those 170,000 didn't finish the course, and it turns out that learning is a complex business, and sometimes it's really significantly enhanced by being in a classroom, having face-to-face interaction with a professor, feeling the kind of support, but also pressure from fellow students to perform and to show up to class ready to do problem sets or answer questions or whatever it might be. And so those initial MOOCs, didn't work so well. Now, increasingly, using a combination of hybrid formats and increasingly AI itself, which customizes, any kind of syllabus for the individual student and can identify, where there are problems and really become invaluable in terms of helping a student learn stuff that they might find difficult in certain very particular, very individualistic ways that were not being addressed by just the massive online open course. To find that, of course, there really are ways in which online education can democratize higher education in the best possible way, and to do so in a way that also, really brings the best teachers into contact with students, whether or not they can get into Harvard, or for that matter, these days, whether or not they want to get into Harvard. But I think it's important to also keep in mind that residential component, that the face-to-face component, is also important. And we don't want to get to a world in which it's only the rich who get the residential experience and everybody else has the online experience. I think we have to, and this is something I talk about in my book as well, we have to find new ways to lower overall costs for everyone so that you can actually have some kind of mix and students can take advantage of these new remote online formats, but without losing altogether the social character and significance of some of the things that old-fashioned, going to college experiences have afforded.
And we should mention that the book is published by Cambridge Press. Again, it's called City of Intellect. And question from Reed in Santa Rosa: I'd like to know your opinion about the community college and junior colleges in the country, which are bringing higher education into working communities and to those with fewer resources.
Well, absolutely, and they often are the real workhorses of the higher education sector. And I apologize for not mentioning them as much. I've spent my entire career as you mentioned, Michael, in not only in 4-year colleges and universities, but in some of the best academic institutions in the world. But by the same token, it's if we're actually thinking about democratizing higher education, the community colleges have been doing that for decades. Going back to Clark Kerr and the master plan, one of the most important things that he introduced was support for community colleges, with the idea that students from community colleges would then have a direct pathway to transfer into places like Berkeley and UCLA, as well as Cal State, Northridge, and so on, after 2 years, with the kind of foundation that the community college provided, but also with a direct pathway to get into the 4-year college if that's where the student wanted to go. But community colleges are often under-resourced. They're not given the kind of support they need. Community colleges can do both very specific vocational kinds of training, and they can, and they do this for students who go on and transfer, provide even the foundation of the liberal arts. But you have to be able to, find ways to support the faculty who are going to teach in these. It doesn't come with the prestige of teaching at the Berkeleys or UCLAs, but it does come with a really important role that will not be played by other kinds of universities. And I think, the argument I was making about delinking the different kinds of parts of the university ecosystem is first and foremost about taking some of the parts that we already have out there, like the community colleges, and finding better ways to give them support.
I wonder what your thoughts are, Nick, about what some highlight as concerns about undermining, whether they're valid or not, what was once the ideal of meritocracy, because you write about university as a utopian concept. And many feel that great inflation has become so extreme, and that if you want a meritocracy, you have to put more emphasis on merit rather than perhaps on race or class or whatever. And we're also facing really what some deem to be a crisis just in terms of what a college education really means, what its purpose is, which is really at the core of your book, raising those kinds of questions. So is this a dream now? Is this the fabric of a dream, a meritocracy, that we're talking about a meritocracy?
Well, on the one hand, the introduction, for example, of early versions of what became the SAT actually were introduced in the first instance by admission officers working with some testing agencies from institutions like Yale in the post-World War II period, where the idea was to open up admission to colleges like Yale College to students who didn't go to the fancy private and boarding schools of New England, or students from families that had, by virtue of socioeconomic position and status and the like, a special kind of access to the Ivy League. So it really was animated by this idea of meritocracy. Now, of course, the Ivy League did open up a lot. In the first instance, it opened up to Jewish students who had not gone in great number because they were quotas around their admission, and then progressively to other communities, and both in terms of race and ethnicity, as well as in terms of socioeconomic background. But then, of course, what happens, and this is part of our, the lesson that, that we learn from reading history, is that increasingly, families with money would invest in special tutorial programs for students so that they could perform better in the SATs. And there turned out to be a high correlation between performance on an SAT and socioeconomic background. So it turned out not to be quite as much an index of meritocracy as another index of privilege and
So you
wealth.
started getting rid of those tests in many instances now. Yeah.
So then, that was one of the things that was behind getting rid of this test. Now, of course, just in the last couple of weeks, beginning with Dartmouth, but now being followed by, I think, MIT and Yale just the other day, and other colleges and universities, the SAT is coming back. Because administrators and faculty are arguing that, in fact, if you look at the particular community from which a student comes, you can often identify individuals of high aptitude who might not make it into the admission pool without the advantage of having a test they could take that shows their potential. So it's coming back. It's going to come back in a different way than it was before. I think university admissions officers are going to try to, use it as some information, but not as all determinative in the ways in which sometimes SAT or ACT scores were used before. But it's a constant struggle because on the one hand, you want to have standards. You talked about grade inflation. You want to have standards both in terms of getting into college, and you want to have certain kinds of standards in terms of performance in college. You don't want an A to be seen as a right. You want to be able to see a good grade as something earned. But you're constantly confronting this difficult balance between compensating for what are very different kinds of backgrounds that really do translate into performance, certainly in the early stages of a student's performance and or career, and finding ways to make distinctions, to certainly identify and applaud, great achievement, and to do so in ways that that do cater to this spirit of meritocracy, which is to reward people who both have aptitude, but then really work hard and do well.
Yeah. From your lips to whatever power there is out there's ears. This is Rich from Dallas, who asks a big question. He says, after decades, and thanks for the question, Rich, after decades of automation replacing blue-collar workers, AI is coming for the white-collar workers. How do new graduates stay ahead of the machine?
It's a great question. And, I hate to say this, but I read just the other day, the IMF has come out with a report that is projecting that in 10 to 20 years, a lot of ifs and reservations in it, but nevertheless, in the foreseeable future, up to 50% of current jobs will disappear because of AI. Now, that may turn out not to be true because there will be a lot more resistance to introducing AI for certain kinds of roles, certain kinds of jobs. And that will come both because it will be seen as too disruptive to the economy or to our society, and because there will be resistance from consumers to having, everybody on this call knows that, many times when we actually telephone after getting frustrated with a website, we telephone the number, and then we just say representative until finally there's a person who comes and you say, thank God, for human contact, even if you've been on the phone for half an hour and you finally, you work it through or whatever it is as quickly as you can and come away saying, I just don't want to have my life be handed over to machines. But, the economies of scale are such and the kind of benefit from, the efficiency that AI will introduce, that it's inevitable that a certain degree of labor displacement is going to take place because of AI. And I think it's not even just a question of training people, more advanced computational skills. Look at what GPT is doing right now. It's actually writing code. It's enhancing the performance of the very best computer coders by, some say 5x or others say 10x. It's even with the very best people out there in the labor force in the world of computation, it's computation that's going to come back and maybe take some of their jobs. So this goes and suggests a couple of things. First, the kinds of things that a general education, a liberal arts education, actually produces are going to be more important than ever. The capacity to make judgments, the capacity to think critically, to think broadly, to synthesize different kinds of fields and to interpret what's going on in the world. These are actually going to become more important. But by the same token, I think we have to use whatever collective critical thinking capacity we have to really begin to think seriously about what a future is going to be like when more and more people are moved out of jobs because of technology, because of AI, because of advanced forms of computational capacity, and because these chatbots are going to get better and better and better. And pretty soon, when you get a computer at the other end of the phone call, they're going to actually be able to deal with your problem more quickly than a human. So it's a complex future, but it's one we have to begin to take much more seriously, I think, and I appreciate the question for raising that issue.
Well, I appreciate, as usual, your prudence and your wisdom in all of this, and it also prompts me to ask you, given what you just talked about, and given the projection, perhaps, of a future that is obviously still cloudy and indistinct. I remember Jeremy Rifkin talking about how the internet would displace almost all jobs. What should a university's purpose be, ideally? Or in terms of, the city of intellect, what would be maybe your central or primary recommendation for the future of the university to be this hallowed place, this revered place that you and I have had, in our learning background, tremendous respect for and duty to.
In my sense of the university has been shaped by my belief that it really does transform lives by virtue of exposing us to the kinds of ideas, the kind of literature, the kind of art, the kind of work in science, and everything from theoretical physics to engineering, to a world of possibility, and a world that allows us to think about some of the fundamental questions of what it means to be a human being in the world today. There's a way in which I think, a future that is going to be as uncertain as we now believe our future is going to be, whether with respect to climate change, whether with respect to the role of technology and the increasing power of artificial intelligence, in which it's going to be more and more important to think about the human-machine relationship from the point of view of the human. What is it that makes us human? How do we maintain our humanity as machines get more powerful and more pervasive? How do we actually construct meaningful lives, both in relationship to our fundamental values and immediate communities and families and so on, but also in relationship to a world in which the idea of work may change, the possibilities of leisure may change, in which, as things get more complex and sometimes more perilous, we actually have to, at the end of the day, fall back more on our sense that, we are given this allotted time on this earth, and how do we make it meaningful, both for ourselves and for those who we have some relationship to or impact on. University has to be critical to that. It has been in the past. I think it still is, despite all the commotion taking place. But I certainly am committed to the idea that can be that in the future as well.
On that note, let me first of all extend thanks to all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and to all who will be hearing us on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member or supporter of this podcast, I urge you to go to our website, again, at graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E, and you can join the podcast. And also, you can email any reactions or recommendations to me directly, Michael Krasny at mkrasny@graymatter.show. Thanks to our exceptional Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Colin, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen, and a special thanks to this week's guest, New York Academy of Sciences President and CEO, and the author of City of Intellect, Nicholas B. Dirks. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Michael.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.